Welcome, everybody. There are still participants joining, but I think we'll start because we've got a tight schedule, important content, and we want to make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A. My name is Michael Barber. I'm the chair of the Strategic Review of Policing in England and Wales. The Strategic Review is hosted by the Police Foundation. You'll hear from Rick Muir, its director, in a moment. Today we're launching the phase 1 report of that strategic review, and you'll hear all about that during the conversation we're going to have in the next hour and a half. But if I summarize it, the phase 1 report, which is today's report, is about the problem. What is the challenge facing policing in 2020? And then phase 2, which we'll be working on over the next 9 months to a year, is about the solutions. How are we going to help redesign policing for the 21st century, the middle of the 21st century. What you'll see, and you'll hear this from Rick, who will take you through the presentation in a moment, is that over the last 20 years, and many of you will be familiar with this, there's been a very radical transformation in the nature of crime. The traditional volume crimes have fallen, but cybercrime, fraud, and so on have risen. And then there are some specific challenges, which Rick will take you through. The government has committed to 20,000 extra police officers. They're being recruited now. That's a welcome and necessary step, but nobody thinks that that is the solution to the problems that Rick will take you through. For example, there are 5,000, there's a shortage of 5,000 detectives right now as we speak. The delays on digital forensics are a huge challenge for people investigating crime. There are many challenges that need to be resolved. So I'll come to Rick in a moment, but before that I want to introduce the panel who are going to comment after Rick has presented. First of all, Martin Hewitt is here. He's the chair of the National Police Chiefs Council. Many of you will be familiar with him. Distinguished policing career in Kent and the Met before taking on his current role. Rachel Tuffin will be joining us shortly, we hope. She leads on innovation and standard setting at the College of Policing with a career previously in the National Policing Improvement Agency and the Home Office. And last but by no means least, we have Dee Collins, former Chief Constable, in fact, until recently Chief Constable in West Yorkshire and President of the British Association for Women in Policing. She's also a member of our advisory board. There are about 150 people who've joined, which is fantastic. We're really happy about. The program is basically going to be a 20-minute presentation from Rick on what's in our report, which is released today. Commentary of 5 to 10 minutes from each of Martin, Rachel and Dee, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And the way the Q&A will work is on your Zoom screen, you should see a Q&A function down at the bottom. Most people have got familiar with Zoom in the last few months, but if you want to put a question in there, I will select questions from there and direct them to the right member of the panel, or if they're for me, I'll answer them myself. Just so you know, we're recording this event. So in effect, it's a public event, so bear that in mind. We're going to release the recording of it afterwards. And if you have any challenges, we hope we'll be able to overcome them. But keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking. But otherwise, feel free to chip in on the Q&A function. And right now, I'm going to ask Rick, who's the director of the Police Foundation and the mastermind of this report, to take us through the outline of it.
Right, thank you very much, Michael, and welcome everybody to this morning's event. When we started off with this process, I didn't imagine I'd be presenting this report from my upstairs bedroom, but here we are in these strange times. One of the good things about it is that very many people have been able to join us who perhaps otherwise wouldn't have been able to, so that's great. So I'm going to share my screen now so you can see the presentation. Let me just find the presentation. Great. So, as Michael has said, this is a review hosted by the Foundation and chaired by Michael Barber. It's possible due to funding we've received from CGI, the Dawes Trust and Deloitte, and we're very grateful to them for their financial support. As Michael said, this is the culmination of phase 1, which is very much about describing the challenge, and phase 2 will get into what the solutions to that challenge might be. So the present comes in 5 parts First, I'll talk about what we call the public safety challenge, which is about the objective threats to people's safety. Then we talk about the public security challenge, which is about fear of crime, how people feel about policing. In other words, the more subjective aspects of people's security. Then we look ahead to the future and look at potential future trends. Then we talk about what the role of and purpose of the police ought to be. And then I'll talk a bit about what all of this means for phase 2. So first, the public safety challenge, which is about the objective trends which are shaping the environment in which the police operate. The first big headline here is, which we shouldn't lose sight of, is of course that traditional crime, as measured by the Crime Survey for England and Wales, has fallen very substantially since the mid-1990s. Burglary's fallen by over 70%, car crime's fallen by over 70%. And of course, a lot of that is related to improved security in vehicles and properties. But also violent crime has fallen overall by over 70%. Now, that's not true of all violent crime. And in the last 5 years, you will all know that there's been an increase in knife crime, which is shown in this chart. And of course, levels of very serious violence have therefore increased in the last few years. But overall, crime affecting most people in this country has reduced, at least traditional crime. There's also been another issue which was dominant in the policy around policing and crime in the early 2000s was, of course, antisocial behaviour. And what we see here is that antisocial behaviour, or people's perception of it, has fallen by around 60% since the early 2000s. Now, does that mean that antisocial behaviour itself has gone down? We don't know. It tells us that people perceive it to be less of a problem. Indeed, reported incidents of antisocial behaviour have also fallen. So there's some indication that at least people's perception of the problem of antisocial behaviour has got better. It has improved. But it's not all good news because even though we've seen that massive change that I've just described, we've also seen the emergence of cybercrime and fraud as major components of crime. I mean, in 2019, cybercrime and fraud were 44% of all crime affecting households in England and Wales. So that's a huge component of crime, which didn't exist, certainly not in the same way 20 years ago. So this is a major shift in the nature of the environment in which the police operate. Another big change, of course, has been the welcome increase in reporting of crimes that take place in domestic and private settings. We've seen here a 77% increase since 2016 in reported domestic abuse. We've seen a major increase in the reporting of sexual offences. You'll see from this chart that, of course, most sexual offences aren't reported. Those are the top lines here. The bar charts show those crimes which are reported to the police. But of course, those have increased very significantly. And we found in our police force visits that that has changed the nature of the investigative work that the police do very considerably, requiring new approaches, new skills, and indeed a lot of investigative units are now dominated by work involving looking at sexual offences. So that's a very substantial shift in the nature of police work over the last few years. The other big shift is around incidents involving those who suffer from multiple disadvantage, what gets called in policing, vulnerability related issues. And you can see here a significant increase in the number of mental health related incidents. You can see also this increase in missing persons incidents, which people will be familiar with, which we found was a lot of which was driven by failures in the care system and issues with children going missing from private care homes in particular. So a big challenge there that we want to come back to in phase 2. So issues around people with multiple disadvantage, which are ending up with the police, connected to austerity, I think, as other services have been cut back and the police then having to pick up the ball. Lots of issues around the policing of social tension and public order, which I think when we started this work, I wasn't expecting it to focus so heavily on this, but it's quite interesting that if you look at the number of protests, for example, they've increased very significantly over the last 10 years. And indeed the number of confrontational protests, and that's a term used by Professor David Bailey of the University of Birmingham, who categorises protests, by which I mean things like blockades, occupations, physically destructive protests. The number of those has increased quite significantly as well. So that clearly poses a challenge to policing. Reported hate crime incidents have also increased very significantly in recent years. And of course, the threat of terrorism is something that remains, and indeed has shifted in form. So we still have the issues around Northern Ireland, which remain a threat to the UK, and we also have the Islamist terrorist challenge, and indeed an increasing challenge from far right groups, which has grown in recent years, and we talk about that in the report. Organised crime has become more sophisticated, and we can clearly see that with increased reporting of modern slavery and human trafficking offences, the rise of county lines, which has clearly become a more complex form of drug dealing activity and has links through to the serious violence problem that I was talking about before, moves across forced boundaries and poses a challenge to our policing model, I think. And then, of course, the move of organised crime into things like money laundering and fraud, which are hard to detect, and people can make a lot of money doing that sort of thing. And so there's been a very significant increase in organised crime activity there. So our conclusions from this section are that the scope, variety and complexity of the public safety challenge facing the country, we don't think certainly can't be tackled by the police on their own. It's too complex for that, it's too varied for that. Other actors have to play a role, and we think that the police as currently resourced and configured aren't going to be able to successfully deal with all of this range of problems either. And the police do a huge amount of excellent work, but this is we just think the range of demands that we're now expecting of the police have just got so great that we really need to rethink in a number of ways. And the first thing I think, in phase 2 we want to look at as a result of that is thinking about the role that the police play as part of a wider system. We need to think about that wider system. We can't just think about policing in isolation. And I think we need to be more explicit about the role of the police in that system. And I'll talk a bit more about that towards the end of the presentation. And then, of course, we need to go on to look at the skills and resources the police need to perform their role. Public security. Now, safety, people's sense of well-being, their sense of security, their sense of certainty about how to live their lives, all of that is affected not just by the objective threats of crime, but also about how they feel. If people live fearful lives, then that's not a good thing. And so it's an important thing that we address the more subjective aspects of security, as well as the trends in crime and so on that I've described. And two aspects of this I want to focus on here are fear of crime, and secondly, how people feel about the police. So crime has been growing as a concern. If you look at the Mori Issues Index, crime rose. In 2019, it reached its highest level since the 2011 summer riots. So it has concern about crime has increased significantly. It's dropped off now because, of course, coronavirus now dominates of concern. And some of that, I think, is linked to, you'll see the top blue line here, more people think that crime is rising. And there's an interesting disjuncture here, which criminologists and people in policing will be familiar with, which is that although people feel that crime is rising, actually their fear that they themselves will be a victim of crime has been falling. So the lines at the bottom of the chart show that people are less fearful personally about becoming a victim of car crime, violence and burglary. They're more worried about being a victim of fraud, which is that small red dot you can see on the left-hand side. But people think that crime is going up, and that may be related, of course, to things like the rise in serious violence that we've talked about. People are unlikely to be a victim of that themselves, but it makes them worry about crime. So a sense of unease out there which needs to be responded to. How people feel about the police is an important source of security, because if people trust the police, if people respect the police, if people think the police will treat them fairly, source of security in and of itself, you don't think, then that's a source of insecurity. And so it's really important to look at police legitimacy as part of this review. And you'll see that public confidence in the police is high. 75% their local police. The top line there shows that people feel that the police treat the public with respect, overwhelmingly think that the police would treat them with respect. So these are pretty positive findings for policing, I think. We do note, however, that in the last year those ratings have all declined slightly, and obviously we want to see whether that's part of a trend or just a blip. Because it's important to note that confidence is not equally distributed among the population, and specifically black communities, people of mixed ethnicity have much lower confidence in the police than people who are Asian and people who are white and than the national average. So that is obviously a core cause for concern that we need to look at as we move into phase 2. So on public security, there's a strong bedrock of public support for the police. Although ratings have eroded slightly over time, there is concern about crime among the public, although they're less fearful about being victims of it themselves. And there are many within minority communities whose trust and confidence in the police is much lower, certainly than white people and than Asian people as well. And we need to address that as we move into phase 2 of the review, because legitimacy, as we know, is a core asset for policing and is extremely important. So looking ahead, in the report we set out 10 trends which we think will help shape the environment. I won't go through them here because you can look at the report. I just want to draw out some implications from policing from those trends. The first thing to say is that all the sources of greater complexity that we've identified in police work will persist, and we think will intensify in the years ahead. For a start, the information space, the internet, will become an ever more central terrain for public safety and security. And policing will need to consider what its role in tackling crime and harm on the internet is going to be. All of the challenges that are the consequences of social fragmentation and social disadvantage, we think will remain pressing, and some of those could get greater. So for example, we anticipate that more people will be living alone, and that loneliness we know is connected to mental health problems. So that is likely to be a continual source of challenge for public services as a whole, and also for policing. We think that there's likely to be more high impact disruptive events. These can become more frequent, particularly as a result of climate change and more extreme weather events such as flooding. That is likely to be an increased threat. And there's some thought that things like pandemics, which we're obviously living through this enormous crisis at the moment, they may become more frequent as movement around the world is easier, and as more people live in cities, that is also an ingredient to contributing to pandemics. So all of these things may become more challenging, and will need greater agility and collaboration across policing, I think. The policing of social tension and the maintenance of public order will become more challenging, and the police will need the resources, the approaches, and the legitimacy in order to deal with those challenges. The fiscal situation, this is the second sort of big point. The fiscal situation we think will be more difficult partly because of the impact of COVID on the public finances, but also because of the impact of an aging society. And so things like pensions, health, and social care will require more public spending inexorably as we become an older society, and that crowds out the space for public spending on other areas like policing. And so that is something that we need to be aware of, unless of course we significantly increase taxes or economic growth is much more successful than is anticipated. And we think there is therefore, because of all of that, a growing risk of a gap opening up between what the public expects of the police and what the police are able to deliver. So I'll finish by talking about the role of the police. It's important to talk about this, we think, because we've already said that we think it's unrealistic to expect the police to deal successfully with all of these demands. So we need to think about, well, what do we want the police to do? Where do we want them to focus? We also think the existing ways of thinking about the role of the police are quite unsatisfactory. The Royal Commission in 1962 simply listed all of the things that the police do and said, this is what the police should do. Well, we don't think that's a very satisfactory way of approaching this question. You can't just say, well, this is what the police do and that's what they should do. We need to think about, what do we think the police should do in the light of everything we've said here? So we think we need to think harder about the role of the police than perhaps has been done in the past. And also people tend often, when thinking about this question, to go back to the Pelian principles. And there's a lot of good value in the Pelian principles, but we think they don't really help draw boundaries around the police role because they're quite vague and quite open-ended. They can be interpreted in so many different ways. It doesn't help with prioritization and thinking about what should the police do, what should others do. So we think we need to think a bit harder and be a bit more explicit about the police role and what the role of other actors should be. That's why we're thinking about this. We talk to the public in a range of focus groups about what they think about this. And it's quite clear, people won't be surprised by this, I don't think. The public they like visible local policing. That's no surprise. More surprising perhaps is when you give the public more information about what the police do, they support a focus on high harm. So people tend to think that the public, just want to deal with lower level stuff. Well, actually, when you talk to people about what the police do, provide them with information, they say, well, yeah, of course you should focus on sexual offences and modern slavery and so on. They think that those things are obviously harmful and support them being prioritised. The police also have quite a traditional view of the role of the police, which tends to focus on crime and also immediate threats of harm. I think the public in our focus groups anyway, thought that the police have a role in prevention, but they don't think the police should go too far in that. They think that the police should be focused on immediate threats of harm. So the 5 working assumptions that we've developed, and we have a paper by Professor Ian Loader, which has helped us in this as well as all the responses to our call for evidence. First of all, the police are not just crime fighters. They do a whole range of other things, and indeed 80% of the calls they get don't result in crimes being recorded. So they're obviously not just crime fighters, and they deal with a whole range of other threats to harm, threats of harm. And so that's the first point. The second point is the police operate as part of a wider system of actors who all contribute to public safety and security. And in a way, the police role there has kind of evolved more by accident than design, what the police do, what others do. Sometimes that's a result of explicit decision by government, changes in the law and so on, but often it's just the way demand has changed and the police have had to adapt to it. And so we think we need to think harder about what is the police role, how do they fit as part of a wider public safety system, and that's what we'll look at in phase 2. We think the police have a role in prevention, but clearly we need to be clear about what that role is and what is the role of others, because I think if they go too far upstream, they'll start to do things which should more be for other professionals to be doing. And that's something I think we need to think hard about. What is the role of the police in prevention? We also think the police have an important role in the safeguarding of those who are vulnerable and have complex needs. But again, we need to think about the parameters of that. We talk about that more in the report. The police do have a role in supporting those who are most disadvantaged and most vulnerable. But we need to think about, what's their role beyond just the immediate response, and what else are they there to do, problem solving and so on, and what is the role of other agencies. And so we want to really get into that, as I say, in phase 2. And the final point is that the police, the work that they do, how they work is an important component of security in and of itself. And so that comes back to the legitimacy point, that how the police operate has a big impact on how secure people feel. And there's good signs of that in the evidence we've accumulated, but also some issues in particular around how many people in minority communities feel. So we need to address those questions in phase 2. Finally, and I'll just finish on this, these are the key questions we want to address in phase 2. What should the role of the police be? What should the role of the police be, building on the assumptions I've just set out? How should they relate to other agencies as part of a wider system? How can the legitimacy of the police be strengthened, particularly among communities where it's lower? What are the implications of all of that for the future of the police workforce? We welcome the 20,000, but what skills do they need? What progression opportunities the police officers need, and so on. How should policing be resourced? How should it be organised locally, regionally, and nationally? And how should it be governed? And a huge agenda there. And I'll just close by saying we will be issuing a call for evidence for the second phase. So we do invite people to submit evidence to us when we open that, because we'll be really interested to hear people's responses on all of those questions. And then I'll go back to Michael and the panel.
Rick, thank you very much indeed for a very comprehensive, rapid, thorough, thoughtful survey of the work we have been doing and the work we plan to do. And you can see in the questions that Rick lists at the end just how many challenging questions we have to, hopefully with the help of everybody on this call over the next 9 months to a year. But thank you very much. Now, three panelists are going to comment on where we've got to and bring their thoughts to bear on this in the next few minutes. I introduced them at the beginning, so I won't introduce them again. Martin, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for giving me the chance to say a few words on the report. I think the opening point for me is the report really demonstrates just how fundamental policing is to society, but equally, I think, how careful we have to be not to just take that service and our legitimacy for granted, and really the point that we don't operate in a vacuum, and I'll come to a bit more of that. And I think both of those points have been really demonstrated since the report probably was largely written by the COVID experience, and for that matter, the George Floyd, the international response to the death of George Floyd. I very much agree with those three drivers that are changing the environment for us: the technology, the globalization, the complexity of society, and I'll make a couple of comments. But on the technology one particularly, I think one thing we have to bear in mind is that presents us with opportunities as well as presenting us with threats. And I think there is really something for me about how the service and law enforcement more broadly embraces the opportunities that technology do give us. All of this is written on the back of a decade of austerity, and we mustn't forget that. And that's not just austerity for policing, that's for all public sector. And whilst the 20,000 additional officers is fantastic and is a great relief for the service, it doesn't go close to dealing with all of the issues that I think the report highlights that we need to deal with as we go forward. And where we are is in an equation between demand and resources that at the moment I don't think we can square that equation. And that's not just resources in numbers terms, but it's in capability and it's in the construct of how we use those resources. So just quickly, the reductions in volume acquisitive crime show the real benefits of what I guess we would call situational crime prevention. That's great, but I think the question for us now is how we deal with the threats that are facing people now. And I always come back to a quote that someone gave to me years and years ago, who said to me, you know, your job in the police is to keep me safe. The difficult thing for you is you've got to understand what makes me unsafe. And I think that was a true comment then, but it's an even truer comment now in terms of how do we take those prevention approaches into a world where the nature of the risk and the threat to people is much greater. And of course, the online gives us the online offences that you talk about give us that very clearly. But what's really interesting there is new victims, new players as well. If we were having this conversation a few years ago, we probably wouldn't have been talking about hostile state actors in terms of some of the criminality, but that's what we're seeing in that. And what you get in the online offences is volume plus complexity. Complexity in terms of the skills that we need, and complexity in terms of the time it takes for us to deal with those. Really important, the point about mental health mispers, the kind of broadly the kind of safeguarding. One of the lines that I use is, from being a service of last resort, we've increasingly become a service of first resort in many cases over the last years, which I think has driven some of the real pressure into the service. And equally talking about protest and that phenomenon that we're seeing worldwide of a change in the way democratic politics is working across the world, quite frankly, and the nature of protest, the nature of disorder, the incredibly mixed groups that we are facing when there is protest in this country now in a way that we wouldn't have seen 10 years ago, and increasingly that being seen by people as their mechanism for having their voice heard, and how the service responds to that is really important. It's critical around resourcing, and I think it's also critical around legitimacy, which I'll come to. Rick has spoken about the drugs and the violence. Those violent rises, I think, have had a really important impact on people's perception of crime. They are not evenly distributed, but I think particularly through things like the county lines phenomenon, we are seeing much greater spreading of that threat being seen in individual communities. And SOC, serious organised crime, and CT, growing threats threats we are understanding more about, developing threats, serious organised crime showing real ability to exploit situations. They've exploited the COVID situation, and they're exploiting technology, they're exploiting globalisation. So real challenge around that, and how we organise ourselves as a service and as a law enforcement community to deal with that. People will have seen the recent examples, the great successes with some activity recently, but very hard to deliver, opens our eyes about problems that we perhaps never saw before. So some real issues around that. And CT, as has already been said, ever changing, feeding off those drivers, particularly technology and social media, and again, new players coming into play. So there's a lot that's changed. I think it's a good summary of where we are. And of course, I think the challenge is, as we go forward, the speed of that change is only going to grow. So really some kind of big questions for me around part two that I think are really important around the service. I think COVID, more than anything, has absolutely demonstrated policing is about more than just crime, but can we remain as the sort of societal safety net for a lot of vulnerable people? And I don't think we can, and Rick kind of alluded to that. So really questioning where does our line of involvement in terms of the sort of safeguarding the vulnerable, not criminally vulnerable, but vulnerable through other issues. I think we really need to ask some questions. Legitimacy is absolutely fundamental. And I think there are two legitimacy tests. If you're asking whether we have legitimacy, the first test for me is, do I trust the police will treat me fairly? And that's a really important test for our legitimacy. And as the figures show about trust and confidence, in some communities, the answer to that question would not be yes. And we need to work really hard about how we drive that legitimacy around the fairness test. And then importantly, the second test is, are the police going to do something useful for me? Because we can't be legitimate if we're not doing something useful. And I think with the changes in some of the crimes that we're seeing and some of the challenges in society, it's going to be really important for us to be very clear about what the role is we have, so that expectation can meet reality. There is a significant security versus liberty debate. Whether you are talking about protest, whether you are talking about use of technology, that is a live debate. And I think one of the big challenges for the service is we can't be the people out front leading that debate. Look at some of the challenges that have happened around things like facial recognition technology. Facial recognition technology is a useful tool. It is technology that exists. It is technology that is already deployed. It shouldn't be the police being out the front having the debate about where society's appetite for this is and how we should control and manage that. Massive issues around what a workforce strategy looks like. The 20,000 is great, but we know when we look at the nature of crime, the nature of what we're having to do, we will not have the same workforce in 5 years and 10 years' time. So how do we get that strategy working? And then, of course, the local, regional and national that comes out through. We have a structure that is quite complex. It's based around local forces with some regional capability, with some national entities. And I think there's an absolutely critical bit of work, because we need capability at all of those levels. We need accountability at all of those levels. But at the moment, I don't think the way we are structured answers those questions effectively. And we have to ask some really fundamental questions about that. I think what all of that comes to is what I would describe as a public safety agenda. And perhaps one thing that I didn't think came through as strongly, I agree, the police, the public police, clearly have a role in public safety. But we also then have to work with all the other partners, the kind of public sector partners that we work with, and particularly the criminal justice system is critical around legitimacy. We also have to work with the public and have a relationship with the public about how they keep themselves safe and how they work with us to keep safe. And the really important point that I didn't see so strongly is around the private sector as well. Because if we're going to achieve that same kind of crime prevention in online world, in the fraud world, then that for me says different relationships with the private sector organisations in a way that perhaps we haven't had before.
Yeah.
You do get the question of how on earth do you afford all of this? We are going into a situation where I suspect in all but name, we're going to be into a period of austerity because of the economic impact of particularly COVID and what that will be for a number of years to come ahead. But really, just in summary, I don't see all of this as a kind of counsel of despair in any sense whatsoever. I'm sure some people will look at this and say this means the police can't cope, they're not capable of doing this. There is much that we do, I think, very effectively, and there is much that we do very well. And linking that kind of legitimacy and where we need to change, the way I kind of view things is I think we absolutely need to uphold what is best about that British policing ethos that is about connected to communities, is about being of communities and working with people, is about that sort of the way that we operate and the way that I think we've operated through COVID. But at the same time, we have got to adapt and we have got to transform to meet the kind of public safety challenges that all of us face in the 21st century. And we cannot stay doing what we're doing now, but that has to be done with all those other actors who are part of this. And I think too often it ends up as, you know, to use that old phrase, what are the police doing about it, is not a, you know, when you look at the complexity of the challenges that we face now, we can't go forward in that way. So everybody has got to be locked in to play their part.
Thank you very much, Martin. That is very thoughtful commentary on the state of affairs, but also setting a very significant, I'd even say profound agenda for the policing ahead. And there are questions piling up on the Q&A, some of them related to that. But thank you very much for the wisdom and insight there. And it makes me slightly daunted about thinking what we've got to get done in the next year. Rachel, you're next. I introduced you at the beginning. You've played a big role in evidence-based policing. You're leading on innovation and standard setting for the College of Policing now. What thoughts do you have to add to what Martin's been saying, or indeed to what Rick set out?
Yeah, what a great opportunity to have an early read. It's been fascinating actually. And I really welcome the report. I think it's a great overview of the issues we face. I was thinking originally, before reading it, that it was a tough gig actually, because there's been quite a few sort of pieces of work that have drawn together all of this evidence. I was thinking, you know, what could this bring new? But I think it does bring some new insights, and I'll say a little bit about what those are. So well done. And I thought I'd frame it in three chunks, what I'm going to say. So first of all, sort of going back 20 years and looking at the past and how we've got to now, then looking ahead to the future, and then coming back to now and thinking about the next stage of your review. So going back 20 years, that was around the time that we were doing big pieces of research on neighbourhood policing. We were looking a lot at public perception and how that was affected by changes in very neighbourhood level crime, much more than it was by the big sort of macro crime and robbery, burglary, those crimes. Actually, neighbourhood issues seem to be very much influencing public perception. And one of the things I was really struck by in the report was it looks like that might be shifting. So it looked as if serious violence was actually having some kind of impact on people's perceptions of what's happening in terms of crime, and that's quite different to what we'd seen before. And I wondered there if there is something different happened connected to digital. I'm always a bit of a skeptic about how much impact digital our digital interconnectedness is having, but actually I think there might be something here to explore. So we talk about word of mouth as the thing. You can see that in the report. People say that word of mouth drives some of their perceptions around crime. Well, what if word of mouth is no longer physical word of mouth, which is pretty standard? We would all think, yeah, probably word of mouth is also our social media connections. That creates a totally different picture in terms of how people are understanding what is my neighbour's experience or my friend's experience. Word of mouth isn't just how we talk to each other, it's a whole connected world of social media. So no wonder maybe that serious violence information can then drive people's perceptions of crime in their local area much more, even if there is not really serious violence in their own area. So I thought that was really interesting in terms of the impact of digital. And another connected impact of digital point was around, so perceptions of antisocial behaviour back in the day. A lot of that was driven by perceptions of young people. And I thought, as that was so striking, that finding, I'd have a little peek at what the ONS stats tell us about that. And it's really striking. that within that bigger, broader category of antisocial behaviour, there's been quite a dramatic reduction in people's perceptions of the nuisance of young people hanging around. And it hasn't gone down for things like rubbish or abandoned cars or people dealing drugs. Some of those things have kind of stayed at the same level. But young people, the nuisance of young people has really dropped. And I think that's quite striking because, again, I mean, I'm perhaps being a bit anecdotal, but, you know, it could be that mostly they're inside computer gaming with each other. And I think some of those big shifts around what young people are doing is also affecting what we're seeing in terms of antisocial behaviour perceptions. So two massive impacts of digital kind of change, which I perhaps wouldn't have expected, and were really striking for me in terms of linking to Martin's point about legitimacy and confidence, because that means that so much of people's experience, much more perhaps than I was really thinking, is being driven by their experience online potentially. And that means that legitimacy and confidence for the police is then being connected to that in a way that perhaps I wouldn't have expected. So, okay, looking ahead to the future then, it's great to see the college's work referenced there. We're just about to launch a piece of future does a good job of setting out how those trends and issues are going to create a new environment for us and getting us to think about how to prepare for it. So coming back to now then, I think, so in the report you talk about the crime fighters, order maintainers and protectors of the vulnerable, those three categories. I think there's actually something that links those three and perhaps a different way of thinking about what we expect and do with policing. And it's the expectation that police manage risk on behalf of society. They respond to risk, they manage for us. The risk is always, you don't know what's going to happen when you go into a scenario. So these statements about things like, you know, X% of what they deal with isn't crime, but it might have been until they got there. So they don't know what they're walking into. We don't know what they might be walking into. It's always unexpected. It's about risk and it's the unknown. And that is a lot of what policing does. And when an officer goes into a situation or indeed a PCSO, they never really know what they're going to encounter. And we're expecting a huge range of things from an officer when they enter into a situation. We're expecting that they will respond to whatever the emergency is, establish order, safeguard people, start an investigation, and make sure within all of that they are promoting legitimacy and increasing public confidence. Now, if you think the number of situations that an officer could find themselves in and the number of different elements, all of the different things that are happening when they walk into a situation, cognitive overload is a very significant issue for them. You know, just having so much information and so much that they need to do. I think we need to be doing an awful lot better at helping to prepare and support officers for those moments in all sorts of different ways, partly about how we use digital, partly about having a better curriculum, better learning support. There's all sorts of things that we could do there, which I think will be really interesting for the next steps of the report, to think about that, not just on the individual officer, but on the organisations that are policing. You know, because if that's what's happening to the individual officer, imagine the bandwidth stretch for the organisations that are trying to respond to all of those potential situations, potential risks, potential harm. It's like, what do we societally, what are we prepared to accept in terms of risk? I think that's a big question for us, you know, because they're managing it on our behalf. Policing, we're managing this risk. Policing's managing this risk on behalf of the public. But what do we accept? Because the more we try to control, the more we need to spend, and the more guidance, advice that we stack up over policing. I think we really need to take a hard look at that in terms of risk. And that would take me to my final point, that the report mentions the budget for policing as, you know, in the billions as it is, and asks a question about that budget. I think we also need to think about the relative budgets elsewhere, you know, because actually it's dwarfed by comparison with spend in other areas. And when you think about the number of things that policing are trying to cope with in terms of the bandwidth issue, you know, across terrorism and floods and COVID, as well as all the usual investigative and the historical investigative, you know, it is very, very significant. And as I say, unknown. Much of it is unknown until they step into it. Some can be prepared for, some can be prevented. But I think that issue about risk for me is hugely important, and how we use digital, coming back to that, as an opportunity to help with a lot of that, I think would be massive. But the societal issue is the big one. How much are we prepared to allow risk? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I love the way you illustrate risk at the level of the individual officer going into a completely new crime moment, or may not even be a crime moment, but a new scene, and then having to respond to that complexity and the risks involved. And then you also sort of multiply that up and look at it at a societal level. And they are huge and challenging questions. And certainly in my visits to frontline police forces in Warwickshire and the West Midlands and South Wales, you see that that's in the heads of police officers when they address a situation like that. Well, how am I supposed, you know, what will I confront and how will I deal with it? And I'm impressed, in spite of obviously stories of when that sometimes goes wrong, how professional our police officers are in those situations. It's really quite
absolutely.
So thank you for your contribution. Dee, I introduced you at the beginning, so I won't introduce you again. Thank you very much for joining us. A few observations from you. We've got 18 questions piled up on the Q&A. I'll come to those in a moment, but first of all, Dee, your observations on the report, the state of affairs, and what you think we should be looking at in the future.
I take the hint, Michael. I shall be brief.
No, you've got 10 minutes, certainly, if you want.
So Martin's given a great summary, I think, of the content of the report and the kind of what's the impact, therefore, on policing and communities and the wider public. I think Rachel's points around how that is actually going to potentially impact on individual officers and staff and communities is important, particularly around the risk. I suppose, having had the benefit of being able to contribute towards the report and the finalisation of it, I've had some time to sort of think about a little bit of the so what, really, not least of which is the fact that Martin's alluded to the shifting sands of, even today, things are changing. So we've got to make sure we keep a watching brief between this report and the preparation for the next one. I think there's going to have to be some really careful, thoughtful language used, because even the word protest in itself creates a mindset for so many members of even the organisation themselves, but also for the public. So I think if we're going to progress working around what does phase one tell us, we really need to think very carefully about our communications, our engagement plans, particularly with members of the public, because sometimes policing can almost have a language of its own that those within policing understand. Perhaps the public don't necessarily see things in quite the same way. I think that's going to be really, really important. It's interesting, isn't it, that it's only a couple of weeks really since Sir Tom Windsor's report has come out in his annual statement. There's a lot of parity in his views of where he thinks policing is with this report, which I think is quite a good opportunity, not least of which is this big thought around how are we going to deliver policing services in the future? What is that brand going to be? And what structures and governance need to be put in place around it? Particularly when there's no doubt that there's going to have to be some big changes around national and regional and local approaches, and the current political model that is policing is built upon. I think the very, very real question we've got to ask ourselves is, what is the true appetite for change, for true reform? And let's capitalise upon that. And I think until we really understand that we do have to change and we do have to reform, it's going to be increasingly difficult. That said, I think there are plenty of people who are up for that challenge. And that's all I really want to say at the moment, Michael. Thank you.
Well, that was extremely succinct and very significant. Thank you very much indeed, Dee. Look, there's a whole series of 23 questions for now risen. I'm trying to read them in the as they come in. I won't be able to deal with all of them. I will ask Rick and the team to gather the questions together and maybe email some answers where we don't have time to discuss them in the next half hour. Actually, we've got 40 minutes thanks to Dee's succinctness. So the first question I have is which came up in Martin's, but is actually implied right through all the commentary we've just had, is this question about how the police communicate with the public, how you get legitimacy through the communication, the dialogue you have with the public about what the public want, about what the police can and can't do, and forms of accountability. And there's a question on that from Jackie Smith, a former Home Secretary. So I want to pick up that question first. What do we think collectively, and maybe I'll come to you first, Dee, about quality of communication between police and the public, and what that implies for accountability, both at local or force level? You've been doing that in West Yorkshire, but also at national level.
I think this is incredibly difficult, because you've really got to understand the communities and the audience that you're speaking with. Traditionally, we used to go and have public meetings and have very, very few people attend, so clearly that wasn't necessarily getting some of our messaging through. Many forces are now making the best use they can of social media, but of course what that tends to generate is a lot of polarised discussion around the point that you're trying to make, and you end up in a lot of dialogue trying to recover the message that you originally wanted to go out. I think it's very, very difficult. Perhaps one of the key things is to go to those areas of research, the academics, to find out what has actually worked. Because I think one of the big things that policing is not terribly good at is sharing what works and why, and then giving you the opportunity to experiment and practice and put things in place more locally. I do think that there are a lot of our communities, and particularly because of COVID, that we now risk not hearing and not seeing, not least of which is a lot of older people, a lot of vulnerable people who aren't even coming out of their homes. So we've got to find ways of engaging and thinking about that. And an over-reliance on technology is a risk for me. So I do think there's a number of factors that we've got to think about.
Yeah. Martin, do you want to comment on that? Because that was obviously a big part of your role at national level.
Yeah. So I mean, I would agree with what Dee says there. I think the biggest challenge, and it kind of comes back to that quote I used from all those years ago about you need to understand what makes me unsafe. We talk about the public as if the public is one entity, which it isn't, and we have to get into a position where we are able to talk at a much more micro level. And even the language we use about talking to communities, as Rachel kind of described in her piece, many people are in a community that is not physically in the same place as them at all. The community that's influencing them is a community that's online. We are using much more local, at every level in social media, but that comes with its downsides as well as its upsides. Social media use by the force, where the force is controlling everything that's said, doesn't meet the need. But then as soon as it's opened up, you get the issues where you get different messages. And of course, our structure being individual forces and then subdivided means that you will inevitably get mixed messages. And of course, this is all against a background noise now that is so much louder than the background noise when I first started in policing, and the channels through which everybody is receiving their information. You know, if I take, you know, my teenage children, there is no time they would ever sit and watch a news bulletin on the television. They don't do that, but they are constantly being fed with news, constantly being fed with opinions. They are in groups where there are strong views held and all the echo chamber stuff that people will say. So I think it's incredibly more complex than it was, but the only real way that you can succeed is by bringing that down to a very low segmented level, to talk through the right medium to the people you want to get a message across. But that is incredibly complicated to do when you're doing that in big organisations.
Yeah.
Can I sneak in there, Michael? Just with one little extra bit. So one is on the role of the individual. So how much officers can do in every interaction. So we've got really good evidence that when they engage, if they talk in particular ways, emphasise fairness, emphasise the fairness of the procedure, give the other person a voice in the encounter, all this stuff they call procedural justice, you can actually see the impact of that on people's willingness to comply with the law, provide information. And we've also got evidence, picking up on Dee's point, that kind of interaction you can also do at neighbourhood level, door knocking, talking to people about justice issues. Of course, that's a resource requirement right there. But, you know, PCSOs or with volunteers, you can do that too. That door knocking and those encounters have been shown also to have quite a significant impact on people. It's whether you can afford to do that and what you focus it on. And has that changed? Because that evidence probably about 8 years old. Has that changed in the era of social media would be a question that could be tested.
Great, thank you. That's very good. So I've got lots of questions obviously now, but I'm going to try and group some together. There's a whole theme about police leadership development, workforce capability, expertise, which I'll come to. There's a question that Betsy Stanko asked at the first one about, given the role of scientists and academics in the pandemic, is there something that we should be looking at in how scientists, academics relate to policing? And then there's a question about the criminal justice system, other partners, and how police relate, which was raised by Rick. So if I could start on the this thing about police capability, whether it's leadership in sort of the business areas as well as the policing areas, and then workforce capability. I was going to come to you first on that, Rachel, and then get comments from others, and then Rick, I'll come to you on the question of how our review of policing relates to the criminal justice system and some of these other crucial partners. So, but Rachel, if you comment first on this workforce capability, which you raised anyway, and then I'll take comments from other panel members too. And then after all that, by the way, I'm going to pick up the structure question. Somebody was bound to ask about 43 police forces, so we'll come to that at the end. I'm glad it didn't come up first. But workforce capability, Rachel.
Yeah, I'll keep it really brief. I think for me, it's the huge potential that is not unlocked in officers and staff in policing that we need to think about here. We talk a lot about digital investment, digital spend, and of course that's hugely important and very expensive often, and we're getting better at being more agile on that. But there's this huge untapped potential in our officers and staff, and some of the big ways that we could do more with that is having cultures in policing which allow more innovation, more testing, more failure, but quick failure, and then respond and improve. That's quite tough to do in an environment where, as I was saying earlier, society is expecting police to manage all the risk and make it all fine. So I'd bring it back to that theme. If we want to allow that kind of innovation, testing, trying things out to release the potential of our officers and staff, that has to be done with some understanding of the risk involved, and we need to be able to get some acceptance from media, from government, that is actually going to happen. You know, that not everything will work.
Yeah, thank you. I must say, on the basis of my conversations with police officers on my frontline visits, I was really struck by exactly what you say. There's huge untapped potential if we got systematic career staff development planned into each individual officer's way of thinking about their career and lead into their daily lives. So I just think there's a massive potential there. Does anybody else want to comment on this before I move on? Martin?
Yeah, I mean, I would just really want to say that I agree with that. But I think you do come back, and Rachel and I were involved in an event yesterday talking exactly about how do we get that kind of genuine career, strategic career management going on for people. But you do come back to that demand versus resources equation. Yeah. This is absolutely important to do, but it is costly in time and in abstraction, and all the while the service is unable to square that equation between the demands being placed on us and the resource capacity we have. You inevitably, this is what loses out, and I think that's been a challenge that we face for some considerable time.
My Canadian friend is a professor at the University of Toronto in education. He has this phrase about the 21st century about increasingly the learning is the work and the work is the learning. And so, in other words, you don't separate out the day job going on a course. You're learning continuously from the experience you have daily. And somehow there's more potential we can unlock if we can get that working in policing, I think. But it's easy to say and hard to do. Rick, what about these things to do with the criminal justice system and how we're going to relate to that in the second area? We can't do absolutely everything, but we do obviously need to be aware of those partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we're thinking about this, what we've talked about as a public safety system, clearly the criminal justice system is one sort of sphere of that system. One, in a sense, it's probably the police operate in a number of different systems, and I think when we get into phase 2, we'll think about how those systems work. And they work at different spatial levels as well. There's a local policing challenge. There's an international and kind of cybercrime and international kind of challenge as well. And we need to think about all of these different aspects. But the criminal justice element, needs to be a core part of it. And I think one of the core questions is, obviously it comes back to the role of the police, is that police officers will be, they are described as the gatekeepers to the criminal justice system, because the decisions that they make about whether someone should be charged or not, and how to handle a particular situation, whether to look at it through a law enforcement lens or a safeguarding lens, all of these decisions which officers have to make are clearly very consequential, and we need to think about that. I think in the context of what's happening in the rest of the criminal justice system, particularly around, we've had a lot of court closures. We've got a probation system which is undergoing yet another sort of tumultuous phase of reform. We've got a prison system which we know is overcrowded, and there are lots of issues there. And so I think we need to look at what's happening in the rest of the criminal justice system and think about how the role of the police in that, and particularly around we've seen a lot of good diversion work, where particularly around first-time offenders and young people, but thinking about how much more of that can we do, for example. There are some interesting things to be thought about some categories of offenders where we may need to think about, as a society, how we're approaching that. And it actually goes back to Rachel's point about risk, because one way of managing risk is to put people in prison for a time, but that may not be the best approach for everybody. And so I think we need to think about that, conscious of the fact that there is going to be a Royal Commission on Criminal Justice coming along, and we need to sort of feed into that as well. So within those parameters, I think we'll clearly have to address some of those issues in phase 2.
Great, thank you. And on the question that Betsy Stanko wrote of the questions on the Q&A, what is this? What should we learn from the pandemic and the way science and academia have been involved in that for policing, or do we not need to learn anything? What does anybody want to comment on that? There you go. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Speed is the thing that I would highlight.
Yeah.
I don't mean the drug. I mean how quickly we're able to get evidence into forms that can be useful and share it really fast, and then have an iterative conversations about what it means and how we need to apply it in this specific context. So it's the involvement and how fast we're able to use evidence.
Thank you. Dee, you were going to comment as well.
Yeah, a couple of key pieces of learning for me was that the local resilient forum structure works. They've been rehearsing some of the potential responses around a pandemic for some considerable time, albeit that the national infrastructure that used to be in place sadly isn't there anymore. And I think that's a question that will be raised, I'm sure.
Yeah, well.
The key thing for me was the willingness from the word go to work cross-governmentally. And I think that's the issue that is getting in the way of this position, because once upon a time, of course, it all sat under the Home Office. The minute you start to have more and more government departments, the more difficult it is to work across them. So I think that's the key piece of learning, that when the willingness is there, it's amazing what can be achieved in a very, very short space of time, as Rachel said.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Michael, can I just add a couple of points? Just two, really, to pick up on what Betsy said. I mean, one is the work that we're doing, as we've got a particular strand of work, which is the sort of recovery and reform learning from COVID. And that is very much accessing a whole range of different, certainly different academic opportunities. And then also having working with the Home Office, I am in the process of recruiting a chief scientific advisor for policing. So we're literally at the point of going out to advert. And the two areas that I'm, excuse me, particularly keen on getting someone to access for us is a degree around data science, but also behavioural science as well, because where we have locked into the scientific community through COVID has been particularly around the behavioural science work and how the public will respond and how at various stages of the lockdown we could anticipate. So I'm really keen to bring those two elements specifically, but we will have specifically for policing a chief scientific advisor.
That's interesting, and that picking up Rachel's point and Dee's, you can see how if you've got the data, the science, and then the speed in the relationship between learning and the operations, then you can see how you could really make some differences. I've seen that really well done on vaccinations in Punjab, Lahore in Punjab, Pakistan, where every time a child is vaccinated, the child is photographed, and that photograph is logged in a computer in Lahore, wherever the child is. And so you know exactly which places all the vaccinations in real time, and then you can send the vaccinators to the gaps which appear on your map. And I think that kind of combination of technology, speed, evidence, and then action has got a lot of potential. There's several questions about the structure, one about the 43 police forces inevitably, but also about mergers with emergency services and where that's going. Who would like to comment first on that theme?
Do you want me to come in? Shall I come in?
Yes, and then I'll come to Rick.
Okay, so I think the first point is there is absolutely nothing to suggest that structure is going to be fundamentally altered in the near future. The government have been very clear about that, and I actually think to try and start doing that at the point where we're trying to recover from COVID, where we're going to be in very difficult economic situation, any of those kind of restructuring exercises are incredibly distracting and time consuming. I think, so it's kind of asking the wrong question to say, should we do that? The right question for me is asking, how do we ensure that we have the right capability and capacity at the local level, at the regional level, at the national stroke international level? How do we ensure that our systems are connected in the right way, that we are able to be agile enough to deal with new threats as they emerge, which I think the report demonstrates they're going to be new threats, and how are we able to prioritize within that? So this is about, there is undoubtedly things that need to be done about the governance and accountability to make the system work as effectively as it can be, to make sure that policing activity is being held to account at the right level, and it will be at all levels. There is, I do not conceive of, local accountability for local policing delivery, I think is a fundamental part of what we do, and it's the right way to do it. And I wouldn't want to go to a single police organisation. But at the same time as saying that, it is quite clear that cyber criminality, for example, is literally borderless. So therefore, to try and generate a response to that 43 times in England and Wales makes no sense whatsoever. So it's really, again, looking at role of police, where do we need the capabilities, where do we need to control and fund those capabilities properly, and then where do we hold to account? And that's, I think, the right question, rather than us keep going around the circuit of the 43, because that's not going to happen anytime soon, and we're going to be in a really difficult place where we're going to need all of our attention focused on delivering, rather than necessarily the inevitable distraction that brings.
Right, thank you. Do you signalled, and when you comment on what Martin just said, you might also want to pick up a theme in the questions about neighbourhood policing and its future.
Okay, so Martin actually finished off his piece by saying precisely what I was going to say, which is, if we start off with governance and structure, we're looking at it from the wrong end of the telescope. We've absolutely got to determine what does policing need to be and why, and explain that to the public, then work out how to deliver it, and then eventually look at the resourcing, the structures, the governance that actually are going to make that work. That for me makes absolute sense. Hence, we're going to be doing phase 2.
Yeah.
The issue around neighbourhood policing, I think, is fundamental. When we had large numbers of people engaged in neighbourhood policing, working long-term within their communities, their voices were heard, and we had a much better understanding of what was needed within those localities in terms of policing services. When austerity hit us more recently, neighbourhood policing was perhaps one of those areas that unfortunately we started to take some resource away from in order to try and build other capabilities elsewhere as our policing mission got broader and broader. I think if you go to most members of the public, they still want to see that visible presence, even if it's visibility online, that person that they can go to within their local community who actually understands things from their perspective and understands the language. For me, the role of neighbourhood policing is probably more critical now than it's ever been. And my biggest concern is that we don't continue to invest in it.
So would you in your perfect world then, would you rebuild it as it was before austerity, or would you rebuild it in a different way?
I think it goes back to the question around engaging with communities. You have to have that conversation about what is going to work in a given locality. And it might not necessarily always be the same thing. And as Martin's quite rightly pointed out, a lot of people feel associated with a virtual community. Look at the gaming community, for example. So we've got to be much more thoughtful around the physical neighbourhood policing. Yeah. Also, what does it look like virtually?
I see. Okay, great. These are challenging thoughts. There's a series of questions here, and Rick, I'm going to come to you towards the end of this to pick up points that I may have missed or that you want to make in conclusion, talking about the future of our work in phase 2. But there's a theme about protest, what that means for policing. But there's also references to what's happening in the US with this big campaign to defund policing. What comments would people like to make either on what's happening in the US and its implications for Britain, or on the nature of protest? Is it growing in the way that Rick set out in his presentation? If so, what does that actually mean in practice for policing? Do you want to have a go at that, Rachel?
Oh. Sorry, could you just repeat that, Michael? I was just trying to read some of the questions on screen. Apologies.
I was just talking about the questions to do with the US protests that have led to some to campaign for defunding police forces, but also whether that has any implications for Britain, but also whether the whole question of the rise in the number of protests has implications for policing and how the police should think about that.
Okay, yeah, I mean, on the defunding thing, I think our context is very, very different. If you look at the kind of balance of funding, I think it is very different. I had a quick look to remind myself, and if you think that, you know, our policing budget is kind of dwarfed, really. It's the defence budget is double it, the health budget is 10 times it, the education and security budget is however many times, even more than that. So when you think about everything that policing does, and how much prevention activity and problem solving and neighbourhood policing we expect from policing in this country, I think compared to other countries, I think it doesn't quite make sense to me as an argument. On the protest point, I think, I mean, probably this is one more for Martin and Dee, in terms of the impact on policing organisations. I think in terms of our societally, if you like, I think it's an incredibly difficult line to draw. We've seen that with Extinction Rebellion and with these other protests, peaceful protest, where there's a degree, there may even be a degree of consensus from some that it's the right thing to be doing, possibly, but the police are put in a position where they're having to balance the needs of others to go about their working lives with the rights of the protesters to protest. I mean, we all know that, but I don't think there's any easy answer here, unless I'm missing something.
No, I'm sure there are no easy answers. Either Martin or Dee, with experience of policing protests, what do you have?
So I think you know, Rachel's right. It's always an incredibly challenging balancing act for policing. I think there is no doubt that we're going to see more people coming onto the streets to have their voice heard, for a whole range of different reasons. But as has just been said, you know, the experience last year with Extinction Rebellion at various stages is incredibly challenging and resource intensive for policing. I think it does have an impact on other people's perception of how we are. But I do think we need to protect really carefully the tradition that we have in this country of allowing people to protest. I tend to use the word lawfully rather than peacefully. I think it has to be lawful, and sometimes, you know, even people who are peaceful are not necessarily being lawful. So we have to look at how you manage that. You have to look at how you manage a protest, which is so much more complex than a group. When you have a group in front of you who know are antagonistic, we maybe want to fight with the police, will want to be violent. You can police that in a particular way. What we have increasingly is very mixed groups of people coming out to make their voice heard about issues that they feel strongly about, which makes it incredibly challenging to get that balance right. But equally, I think we are in a completely different context than in the US. And the start point for that takes us back to our discussions about legitimacy, takes us back to our discussions about the relationship between the police and the public. I still think we have a fundamentally different relationship with our public, and we must do everything to maintain that relationship. We are not seen as there as oppressing or kind of, well, you know, there was a great phrase someone in the States used to me when they were talking about why they'd been so successful in I think it was in Charleston, where they'd had a racist shooting. And the point there was that the chief said he had spent 4 years trying to turn his force more like a British police force, where they were regarded as guardians rather than warriors in their community. And I still think we are regarded as guardians in our communities, and that changes the dynamic with those people that want to be on the streets.
And you're arguing that that needs to continue, that idea of guardian.
Definitely, most definitely.
Dee, do you want to comment on this? And then Rick, I'm going to come to you, Dee, on this particular point.
Well, I subscribe to what Martin has said. Public safety has got to be absolutely paramount, clearly. The very real challenge is the motivations behind why some demonstrations and protests take place.
Yeah.
And you get very, very different groups of people, as Martin has said. And one of the factors that perhaps doesn't necessarily get reported on is how the community itself might feel about where that demonstration is taking place. There's a big difference between walking to a city centre and walking in a residential area where different communities may be living.
Yeah.
And then finally, I think the very, very key thing is we need to monitor all the time what the media are saying about that demonstration, and have a very, very quick response if that media coverage is perhaps not as comprehensive as it could be, to show the whole context and the whole picture. And I do think that is something that we have had a greater degree of being fleet of foot about than perhaps in the past, and particularly how almost everybody now can record something on their mobile phones.
Yeah.
So we've got to be very thoughtful about the language we use and how we respond to particularly pieces of footage, to make sure that absolutely we've got to be accountable, absolutely we've got to make sure our planning and our engagement is correct, but also what our subsequent response is going to be. The liaison officers that we have who work with the organisers help massively with all of this.
Thank you very much, Dee. Rick, there's shifting to another question. There's a question from Richard Hobbs about how, in the second phase of our work, we're going to prioritise the various challenges we've identified in the first phase. Would you like to comment on that briefly?
Yeah, I mean, very much, and it sort of chimes very much with what Martin was saying about the whole question of structures and so on, and indeed Dee as well, which is that the way we're trying to structure phase 2 is very much to avoid this thing of sort of, what should the structure be, and then work from there. We're absolutely not doing that. So so the order in which we're going to do phase 2 is to think about role and purpose first, because we have to think about, what do we want the police to do first in order to then address the other questions. So what do we want the police to do? What's their role? What are the role of others, and how should the police work with others in order to do that role? So in other words, how does the country deal with all of these problems? And then what's the role of the police in doing that? And only when we've got an answer to that question, which is hard enough to answer, will we then go on to, well, what does that mean for the skills and knowledge and professional development opportunities that police officers need? And we've heard some really interesting things on that in this discussion, which I think we'd want to pick up. How should the police work with universities and academics, and what should the knowledge strategy of policing be? All of those questions we'll look at as part of a kind of workforce component. And then we'll look at resources. We'll look at police funding and how that funding is distributed and so on. And then we will look at bearing in mind all the issues around austerity that we've discussed. And then only then, when we've dealt with those issues of role and purpose, collaboration, workforce, education. When we've dealt with all of that, we will come to the question of, well, what should the structure look like? And I think we very much. I mean, I obviously don't speak for the whole of our advisory board and so on, but my sense is that the way I think we should approach this is very much thinking about what capabilities do we need, and where should they sit? Where should they sit on grounds of effectiveness, efficiency, and legitimacy? Where should those capabilities sit? Should they be? Should some of them be national? What should be national? What should be regional? What should be local? And you could maybe do all of that without changing the structure, as Martin said. Changing structures is can be a big distraction. We've seen that in the NHS, where it's been restructured many, many times. And so I think our approach to this is going to be, well, what capabilities do we need, and where is the best place to put them nationally, regionally, and locally? And then we'll think about, does that mean we need to change structures and organisations? But we're certainly not going to start from the view of we need to change the structure and the organisation. That will sort of wash out of our thinking towards the end, I think. I think we're going to be very evidence-based about how we do that. And indeed, I know it's great there's so many people participating today, and we are going to have a call for evidence, and we do want as many people as possible to contribute on all of those questions. So do monitor our social media feed, and we'll make sure people are informed about how to do that.
Thank you, Rick. So last question, just a kind of one sentence or two sentence contribution from each of the four of you. The question that's come quite recently, it may have been as a result of Martin and Dee's previous observations, but does there need in England and Wales to be a strategic centre for this whole policing and crime agenda? And then I'll add, is that what the Home Office is in the process of putting in place, chaired by the Home Secretary?
So, I mean, there is now a new structure through National Policing Board and so on. I think for the service, there does need to be a stronger centre, and I've got a programme of work within MPCC looking at how we develop what we do to assist with that, working very, very closely with the College of Policing as well, and working with the Association of Policing and Crime Commissioners. But whatever our structure, there is a reality that we do need to be in a position where we can understand the picture nationally on behalf of the service, and we can talk nationally on behalf of the service. Because
during the era of austerity, also the strategic centre became significantly weaker, didn't it? And so you're looking for strengthening that. Rachel, is that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would kind of just pick up, just to show that I was reading to some use, I would pick up some of the comments people were making about different kinds of science. Martin, I'm sure, wasn't intending to be exclusionary. He mentioned behavioural and data, but yes, social science, yes, crime science, all kinds of science, I think, can help us in policing to manage that uncertainty. And I think the issue that Martin's talking about, the strategic centre, one of the hugely important conversations, I kind of said it at the beginning, I'll say it again to kind of round it off, is that issue about risk and how much risk we're expecting policing to manage for society is quite an important, that's a hugely important thing to specify that in some areas, because otherwise, as Martin was saying earlier, there's no room for a kind of some of the activity that the policing needs to do to improve.
Okay, thank you. Dee, last observation from you on this question, or something else if you want to.
Well, I think in the past, chiefs and PCCs have had to be mindful of that strategic policing requirement. I think it's absolutely essential that we have some dedicated resource, particularly when things are so fast moving, to be able to ensure that the services are delivered where they need to be delivered, rather than the risk of people trying to hang on to resource in case something happens more locally. I think having that operational nerve centre, looking at across the board at what's coming over the horizon, as well as what we're dealing with today, is going to be essential, and I totally support it.
Okay, great. Rick, is there any last observation you want to make? You made a nice rounding off of inviting people to contribute in the future, but is there any last point you want to make?
Well, yeah, it's just to say that the review is operating in a really open-minded way. I mean, we don't have a sort of destination in mind here, so we've set out a set of challenges in the report, and we really want to hear what people think about the 7 questions that I set out. We don't have a set of reforms in our back pocket or anything like that. We're just embarking on this in a genuinely open-minded way, and there are different views on lots of different issues on our advisory board. So I just encourage people to engage with us really, and engage with the process. And we really want to hear from people, and it's an opportunity, I hope, for people to help shape an agenda here for policing that can help address some of the questions that we've been talking about. So we're really open to ideas and suggestions.
Thank you, Rick. And that's a good point to finish on. Well, first of all, I just want to say we've had around 160 people participate in this event, and 57 of them have asked a question, which looks like 1 in 3 or even more to me, which is great. So I very much appreciate the engagement. And as Rick says, we really want to stay in dialogue with you when the call for evidence goes out for the phase 2. We hope that many of you will engage. We will do future events. This isn't the end of the discussion, but we'll keep you in touch, and we'll keep the people who joined this event on our list and make sure we keep in touch with them. And I just want to say in finishing, thank you very much to all of those who joined. Thank you very much to our panelists, Dee, Martin and Rachel. Very, very thoughtful observations, and actually, in spite of all the challenges, very positive in tone and nature, which I find quite inspiring. Rick, thank you very much for all the work right the way through up to this event and today. We look forward to staying in touch with everybody who's joined this event. And I don't know about you, but I finished the event feeling really quite positive about the future of policing, in spite of all that's being thrown at it. And that's because I'm really inspired by the police officers I meet when I'm out in the front line and from the leaders of the police force that we've heard from today. So thank you all very much for joining. I look forward to being in touch.